Hello everyone, it's George from Ireland. Welcome back to my channel. Now, ironically, there's been this Munich security conference going on in Germany, and there was a Munich agreement in Germany in 1938. The same time the current security conference is going on, Donald Trump's minions, his Secretary of State, Marco Rubio and others, they were in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, renegotiating with a Russian delegation head by the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov. And it's about Ukraine. As the Ukrainians correctly say, there can be no agreement about Ukraine without Ukraine. It's also true that the United States is legally entitled to withdraw military aid from Ukraine, and the majority of the military aid that's sustained Ukraine through this war of over almost the last 3 years has come from the United States. And Donald Trump is spot on when he says Europeans need to pay the cost of their own security. Now, the United States has assisted with European security, and not out of the goodness of their hearts as well. There's a bit of that, but it's also because the US perceives it to be in its own interests that Europe is secure, that it has allies. Um, Article 5 of NATO has been invoked once ever, and that's by the United States in Afghanistan, which is why it was almost 30 NATO countries and lots of non-NATO countries sent troops to help the United States there after 9/11. The United States has hundreds of military bases all around the world because they regard it as being something which enhances their national security. Maybe they're mistaken, and there are Americans who speak out against that. But NATO is good for the United States as well as its European members, as well as Canada. We don't know exactly what was said behind closed doors, of course. One thing that was obviously mooted was NATO troops staying in Ukraine after a peace agreement to ensure that the peace agreement is permanent. The idea Russia wouldn't dare attack when NATO troops are there because they're going to bump into them and then there'll be a shooting war with NATO. No more proxy war. So that's one thing that Sergei Lavrov has ruled out. Remember, one of the major objectives, perhaps the major objective for Russia launching this illegal war of unprovoked aggression, was to prevent Ukraine ever joining NATO. Now, Ukraine is an independent country. Even Putin said himself that 2 years ago, and therefore Ukraine is absolutely entitled to pursue its own foreign policy, to seek NATO membership, not to seek NATO membership, or whatever. And remember, way back in 2008, that Bucharest conference, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization said that its ambition is that Ukraine will eventually join. And no timetable was set. And look, here we are, almost 17 years on. It still hasn't happened. Remember, there are 30 NATO member states. It takes only one of them to veto Ukraine joining. At the moment, it looks like Hungary would definitely veto it, probably Slovakia, probably Turkey. You only need one of those to veto it, and it's not going to happen. So if Ukraine ever joins NATO, I think it's at least a decade off. Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, all former Soviet republics, and they're all members of NATO. But Ukraine is the biggest former Soviet republic in terms of area. Remember, Kiev was the cradle of Russia, not Moscow. So that would be a major security guarantee if NATO troops were there. Now, there could be troops from NATO countries, but not under the auspices of NATO. If only 29 NATO countries made it, but not a NATO mission. If 28 countries would happily be part of NATO, dispatch troops, but it wouldn't be a NATO mission. Yeah. Remember, NATO doesn't have an official stance on Ukraine. Yeah, it's true that most NATO countries say we have to arm and fund Ukraine, but some of them do not. Turkey has said we will not give one bullet to the Ukrainians, and we're not imposing any sanctions on Russia whatsoever. We observe the strictest neutrality in this conflict. Having said that, apparently Turkey has sold weapons which they know have then been gifted to the Ukrainians, particularly Bayraktar drones. So what is Trump's ingenious plan? As he said before his election, that he would say they've got to stop the war, and if Zelensky doesn't agree to terms which Trump regards as reasonable, then he would cut off all military aid to Ukraine, knowing the Western Europeans are too short-sighted and too tight-fisted to invest in their own security and save Ukraine. But if there's a deal hammered out, which he proffers to both sides, Ukraine accepts, Russia doesn't, then he would hugely ramp up military aid to Ukraine, and that'll force the Russians to settle. But obviously, the president doesn't have dictatorial power as much as he'd like to. The power of the purse remains with the United States Congress. And some of that huge aid package that was passed last year after it was severely slowed down by many Republicans in Congress, some of that still hasn't arrived in Ukraine because of all these bureaucratic holdups. But it's been US policy for decades to maintain Ukrainian independence. And if Ukraine ceases to be independent, in theory or in reality, and that would be a huge defeat for the United States, and that would be Donald Trump's loss. The United States has abandoned its allies before. Most countries have abandoned allies before. Well, look back to the Munich Agreement of 1938. That agreement in that September in 38, Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, and others. I think it was Pierre Laval, the French prime minister at the time. They agreed that Czechoslovakia, well, would have to cede the Sudetenland to Germany. Now, the United Kingdom had no defense treaty with Czechoslovakia, but the United States does have a defense treaty with Ukraine, the Budapest Memorandum of 1994. So does the United Kingdom to guarantee its independence, its territorial integrity. And Russia repeatedly accepted Ukraine's borders before tearing that up and then illegally annexing 5 regions of Ukraine. Putin himself signed an agreement agreeing that even Crimea is integral Ukrainian territory. So, but for the United States to throw Ukraine to the wolves would even be even worse than what Neville Chamberlain did. Chamberlain did what he did partly to buy time for huge rearmament. Well, the United States is massively stronger than Russia militarily. In terms of obviously its fighter jets or its helicopters, I mean, not only is there more planes, they're much more advanced. They're like 2 generations ahead. Okay, it might have not more tanks. I'm not sure because the Russians have had so many destroyed. Technologically, the United States has got superiority. It's got more of virtually all assets. It may not have more troops, but it's got a higher quality ones, better trained, and they're in all strategic locations. Remember, the Russians have lost so many thousands of assets in Ukraine, and the inferiority of their technology has been proven irrefragably in that Ukrainian battle space. Um, so why would Russia stop now when they think that they've maybe got the Americans on the run, gonna cede? On the other hand, the Ukrainians are really holding the Russians off. They're making very little progress. The Russians suffering very heavy losses, and it looks like they can't recruit men at the rate that they are being lost, and their economy is being slowly crushed with very high interest rates, with a lot rising inflation. They've spent most of their sovereign wealth fund, about 60% of that might well be gone by the end of this year. The sanctions could be tightened, you know, countries moving away from buying their oil and gas, certainly NATO and European Union countries. Notice that NATO and the EU are not exactly the same. 38 NATO countries, 27 European Union countries, and some countries are in one but not the other. Yeah, so look, for example, Switzerland is in neither. It's in Europe, but it's not in the EU, nor is it NATO. But it broadly supports that European Union policy of saving Ukraine. So, you know, they can continue this war through 2025, the Russians. Can they continue 2026? We don't know. There might be another Ukrainian démarche like that Kursk incursion. So the Putin would find this difficult, very difficult in 2026. Can Ukraine afford to wait that long? Obviously, Ukrainians are not really helping themselves by not conscripting every man. All these European countries that Ukrainians have fled to haven't really helped Ukraine because they could have said, Ukrainian men at military age, you have to go back. And if you don't go back, you will be taken back in handcuffs to fight. And if not to fight, to contribute to the military, to the war effort in some way. Okay, I feel for these guys. I know some of these guys. I wouldn't want to get killed either. I know it's easy for me to say, I'm not risking my life and limbs. I mean, I don't judge them for not doing so. But be frank, if you want Ukraine to win, sometimes you have to be harsh. Uh, so it looks like that Trump is going to betray Ukraine to some extent. He is correct. I just don't see how Ukraine could get back Crimea and so on. And he's criticized Biden for not giving enough military equipment, for giving too much military equipment. He really doesn't know his own mind. It's also parsimony. On the other hand, this is a golden opportunity for him to really just destroy the Russian military without a single American getting killed. Just cost a bit of money, some assets, some tanks or whatever, jets which really past their service lives, which are going to be decommissioned anyway, just give them to the Ukrainians because they probably get destroyed in a year or two. They're just about serviceable. Yeah, it's worse than what Chamberlain did. Chamberlain did it sort of because he had to. It was a very, very popular move, not quite as popular as Trump cutting them off like this. So obviously Trump is speaking out of both sides of his mouth. He really has no idea what he's talking about. He is ignorance personified, but it's very dispiriting. Ukraine, they could win in some wise, save some of their country. I mean, I think some agreement will be hammered out later this year, and it'd be something like Russia getting to illegally occupy that territory, other countries not recognizing as Russian sovereign soil, de facto recognizing that Russia is there. And Russia might not agree to troops from NATO countries entering Ukraine. They could just enter it anyway. It's not up to Russia. Russia didn't ask anybody else's permission before forming military alliances, before stationing their troops in Belarus or Kazakhstan or Armenia or ever. They asked those countries, not their neighbors. Europe needs to step up support. Unfortunately, Ukraine may have to look for mobilization. America looks unlikely. Trump is so unpredictable. Who knows? Yeah, he's got a weather vane mind. And of course, if he does meet Putin, no doubt he'll fall in love with Putin like he did with Kim Jong-un, or just sweet talk him because he's such an easy mark, so manipulable. No wonder he's made so many moronic business decisions and lost tens of billions of dollars. The biggest loser. So he may be a loser on the geopolitical stage as well. We know he trusts Putin over his own intelligence community, over even world experts are American on Russian politics. So it's all very depressing. Anything else to say about it? Yeah. But the Republican base, some of this are going to be lapping it up. So I think yeah, it'll be some sort of semi defeat for Ukraine. Of course, Putin may bide his time, build up his forces, wait till he thinks that maybe European support for Ukraine is even weaker, attack again. Obviously, some people in Ukraine want peace and they believe that the war is futile. They've saved most of their country, but they probably can't regain some of this land. Collapse could come on either side. It's obviously difficult to say. The tempo of the war is slowing down, partly because the thaw is coming, partly because the Russians have lost just so many assets and so many troops. I don't want to set up a Dorsch Legenda that Ukraine is about to have a dramatic breakthrough. I mean, I don't think that it is. All right. So yeah, we shall see. And okay, one person detained by the Russians, an American on suspicion of possessing cannabis in the airport. He was set free before these talks. There are 10 other Americans in Russian jails. Trump could have set as a precondition for Riyadh talks, you have to release those 10 guys. And maybe Russia wouldn't have set them all free, maybe 9 or 10, not 9 or 8, but he would have got something, and he didn't even try. Pathetic. Thank you for watching the channel. Make sure you subscribe on Patreon, donate PayPal, georgecallahan79@gmail.com. Toodle pip.